The summer sun blazed high in the Montana sky, turning the dusty main street of whispering pines into a shimmering mirage of heat. Meredith Nelson had been counting pennies for weeks, knowing her situation was dire but refusing to admit how close to the edge she truly was. The last of her money clutched in her trembling hand, she approached Hargrove's general store with determination etched on her face, but her body had other plans. It had been 3 days since her last proper meal. The dizziness came in waves, growing stronger with each step toward the store's entrance. The world tilted suddenly, the wooden boardwalk rising to meet her as darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she heard before consciousness fled was the startled exclamations of onlookers and the jingle of spurs approaching at her run. Garrett McAllister had only intended to pick up supplies before heading back to his ranch. At 32, he'd spent more time with cattle than people, preferring the solitude of his land to the bustle of town. But when he saw the young woman collapse outside Hargrove's, something compelled him to action. He reached her side in 3 long strides, kneeling beside her still form as curious townspeople gathered around. "Give her some air," he commanded, his voice carrying the natural authority of a man used to being obeyed. The crowd reluctantly stepped back. Garrett gently turned the unconscious woman over, noting her pale complexion and the worrying thinness of her face. She couldn't have been much older than 25. "Does anyone know who she is?" he asked, looking up at the gathered faces. An older woman stepped forward, wringing her hands in her apron. "That's Meredith Nelson. Poor thing's been struggling since her pa died last winter, trying to keep that little homestead running all by herself." Garrett nodded, recalling vague mentions of the Nelson place, a small, struggling farm at the edge of the valley. He slipped one arm under Meredith's shoulders and another beneath her knees, lifting her with ease that spoke of years of physical labor. "Someone fetch Doc Williams," he said, carrying her into the store and setting her down carefully on a chair behind the counter. Mr. Hargrove, the storekeeper, hurried over with a glass of water. "Is she going to be all right?" Hargrove asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Before Garrett could answer, Meredith stirred, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal deep brown eyes clouded with confusion. She tried to sit up straight, a flash of panic crossing her features when she realized she was the center of attention. "Easy now," Garrett said, his voice gentler than most in town had ever heard it. "You fainted outside." Meredith's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as memory returned. "I'm so sorry for the trouble," she murmured, attempting to stand but swaying dangerously. Garrett steadied her with a firm hand. "When's the last time you ate properly, Miss Nelson?" Her silence and averted gaze told him everything he needed to know. Turning to Hargrove, he said, "Fill a basket with provisions. Flour, beans, coffee, sugar, bacon, whatever the lady needs." "I can't accept charity," Meredith protested weakly, her pride fighting a losing battle against her circumstances. "It's not charity," Garrett replied firmly. "It's neighborly." As Hargrove began gathering supplies, Meredith pulled a small list from her pocket and a handful of coins clearly insufficient for even the modest items she'd planned to purchase. Garrett took the list from her trembling fingers, handed it to Hargrove, then swept her coins into his palm and added a substantial amount from his own wallet. "Add whatever else she might need," he told the shopkeeper, "and put it on my account." "That's very kind, Mr. McAllister, but I can't possibly," Meredith began, only to be silenced by Garrett's raised hand. "You can argue with me when you're not about to faint again," he said with a hint of a smile softening his weathered features. "For now, let's get some food in you and then get you home." Dr. Williams arrived shortly thereafter, performing a brief examination and confirming what Garrett had already suspected: exhaustion and malnourishment were the culprits. "She needs rest and regular meals," the doctor pronounced, packing away his stethoscope. "Nothing more serious, thank goodness." After ensuring Meredith ate some bread and cheese from the store's supplies, Garrett helped her to his wagon outside. The provisions had been loaded, far more than she had intended to purchase. Despite her continued protests, he insisted on driving her home, the ride to the Nelson homestead was mostly silent. Meredith sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, embarrassment and gratitude warring on her face. Garrett kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at his unexpected passenger. He couldn't help but notice that beneath the exhaustion and worry lines, she was remarkably beautiful with high cheekbones, a determined chin, and those expressive brown eyes that seemed to hold both strength and vulnerability. The Nelson place came into view as they crested a small hill, a modest cabin with a barn in need of repair, a small vegetable garden that had seen better days, and a few chickens pecking in the yard. It was immediately clear to Garrett's experienced eye that the property was struggling to survive without a man's labor. "This is more than enough," Meredith said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "You've been far too generous already, Mr. McAllister." "Garrett," he corrected her, jumping down from the wagon and coming around to help her descend. "Garrett," she repeated softly, accepting his hand. Even through the brief contact, he could feel the calluses on her palms, evidence of her attempts to maintain the homestead alone. "Let me help you with these supplies," he said, already lifting the heaviest sacks from the wagon. Inside the cabin, the sparse furnishings and meticulously clean conditions spoke volumes. Meredith Nelson might be struggling, but she hadn't surrendered to despair. The home was well kept, with small touches, wildflowers in a jar, a handmade quilt on the rocking chair that revealed her determination to maintain dignity despite hardship. As Garrett set down the provisions, a faint meow announced the presence of an orange tabby cat who emerged from under the bed to inspect the visitor. "That's Rusty," Meredith said with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "He's a better mouser than most cats twice his size." "Good afternoon, Rusty," Garrett said with mock formality, earning a surprised laugh from Meredith. The sound transformed her face, and Garrett found himself momentarily speechless. In that brief moment of unguarded joy, she was radiant. After all the supplies had been brought in, an awkward silence fell between them. Garrett knew he should leave a single man and woman alone in her home was hardly proper, yet he found himself reluctant to go. "Is there anything else you need before I head back to town?" he asked, hat in hand. Meredith shook her head, composing herself once more. "You've done far more than anyone could expect, Mr. Garrett. I don't know how to thank you properly." "No thanks needed," he said, settling his hat back on his head, "but I'll be by to check on you in a few days if that's all right." "That's not necessary. I'd like to," he insisted gently. "Neighbors looking out for neighbors is how we all survive out here." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then I'll see you in a few days." As Garrett rode back toward his own ranch, he found his thoughts lingering on Meredith Nelson. The determined set of her jaw despite her circumstances, the flash of pride when he'd offered help, the unexpected melody of her laugh. He hadn't planned on involving himself in anyone else's troubles. Life on the frontier in 1878 was hard enough without taking on additional burdens. And yet, as the sun began to set over the Montana hills, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Garrett McAllister realized he was already planning his return visit. True to his word, Garrett returned 3 days later. This time, he brought not only additional provisions but also tools to repair the sagging fence around Meredith's vegetable garden. He found her in much better condition. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and her steps were steadier. "You didn't have to do this," she said as she brought him a cup of water while he worked on replacing a broken post. "I know," he replied simply, driving the new post deeper into the earth with powerful strokes of the mallet. Meredith watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements and the quiet competence with which he approached each task. "Have you been ranching long?" "Most of my life," Garrett answered, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow. "My father started our place when I was just a boy. Came out from Pennsylvania in '52 with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle. And now the McAllister Ranch is one of the most successful in the territory," Meredith observed. Garrett looked up, surprised. "You know about my ranch?" A faint blush colored her cheeks. Everyone knows the McAllister name around here. I asked about you after your kindness the other day. Nothing special about helping a neighbor, he said, returning to his work. Around here, many would disagree, she replied softly. Most folks are struggling too much themselves to extend a hand. Garrett straightened, studying her face. Your father's passing. That was sudden. Meredith's expression clouded. Pneumonia. It took him in less than a week. We'd had a hard winter, and he pushed himself too far trying to repair storm damage. She looked away, across the rolling hills that surrounded the small homestead. We were just starting to get ahead. He had plans to expand, maybe get a few head of cattle. Garrett nodded, understanding all too well the precarious nature of frontier life. What about other family? None close by. My mother passed when I was 16. There's an aunt in Boston, but she shrugged. This land was my father's dream. I can't just abandon it. And you've been managing alone since winter? Garrett asked, unable to hide his admiration. Trying to, she admitted. Not very successfully, as you saw. The honesty in her admission touched him. Most would have made excuses or painted a rosier picture. You've done better than most could have, he said sincerely. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked side by side, repairing what they could of the homestead's most pressing needs. Meredith proved herself knowledgeable and hardworking, if limited by physical strength for some tasks. As the sun began to set, she insisted Garrett stay for supper, a simple but hearty meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, prepared from the provisions he had purchased. Their conversation flowed more easily now, moving from practical matters of farming and ranching to personal histories. Garrett learned that Meredith had been educated back east before her father's westward ambitions had brought them to Montana 5 years earlier. She spoke of books she loved and her dreams of someday opening a small school for the scattered children of the territory. Most folks out here barely have time to teach their children basic reading and figures, she explained, her eyes bright with passion. But education is what will help this territory grow into something greater. In turn, Garrett told her about his ranch, the challenges and satisfactions of building something from near nothing, and his hopes to expand his operation further west. As he prepared to leave, the earlier awkwardness between them had dissolved into something warmer, a tentative friendship built on mutual respect. Thank you for supper, Garrett said, standing on her porch, the night air cool around them, and for the company. It's the least I could do after everything you've done, Meredith replied. I'll be back next week, he stated rather than asked. There's still that barn roof to see to. She started to protest but stopped herself, offering a small smile instead. I'll have dinner waiting. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Garrett would arrive at the Nelson homestead every few days, sometimes with supplies, always ready to tackle whatever repairs were most needed. Meredith stopped protesting his help and began anticipating his visits, preparing special meals and finding reasons to extend their conversations into the evening. Word spread through Whispering Pines about Garrett McAllister's regular visits to the Nelson place. Some gossip was inevitable, but most viewed the arrangement with approval. Meredith Nelson clearly needed assistance, and Garrett had the means to provide it. If something more was developing between them, well, that would be a natural progression in a territory where unmarried women were scarce and valued. By mid-July, the Nelson homestead had undergone a remarkable transformation. The vegetable garden flourished behind its mended fence. The barn stood sturdy with a new roof and reinforced walls. The chicken coop had been expanded, and a small corral built for the elderly mare that had been Meredith's only livestock, but more significant was the transformation in Meredith herself. Regular meals had restored her health. The constant worry that had lined her face had eased, replaced by a quiet confidence. She laughed more easily now, and the sound never failed to captivate Garrett. For his part, Garrett found himself inventing reasons to visit the Nelson place. His foreman was perfectly capable of managing the ranch for a day, and somehow, helping Meredith repair her homestead brought him a satisfaction that his own successful operation didn't always provide. One evening in late July, they sat on Meredith's porch after supper, watching fireflies rise from the grass as darkness settled over the valley. A comfortable silence had fallen between them, the kind that comes only with genuine companionship. "I've been thinking," Garrett said finally, his deep voice blending with the evening's cricket song. "A dangerous pastime," Meredith teased, glancing at him with a smile. He chuckled, then grew serious again. "This place is looking good now, but harvest will be coming and then winter after that." Meredith's smile faded. They both knew that despite the improvements, her small farm would barely produce enough to see her through the coming year. "I've been thinking about that too," she admitted. "I may need to look for work in town." Garrett shifted in his chair, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. "There's another option," he said carefully. "My ranch needs a woman's touch, has for years." Meredith went very still, uncertain of his meaning. "Are you offering me employment, Mr. McAllister?" His lips twitched at her reversion to formality. "No, Miss Nelson, I'm not." He took a deep breath. "I'm suggesting that perhaps two people struggling alone might do better together." "Garrett," she whispered, her heart suddenly pounding, "are you proposing a marriage of convenience?" He stood and moved to the porch railing, his back to her for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. When he turned, his expression was open, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "There's nothing convenient about the way I feel when I'm with you," he said quietly. "Or how I find myself thinking about you when we're apart." Meredith rose from her chair, her legs unsteady for reasons entirely different from their first meeting. "We've known each other barely 2 months, true," he acknowledged. "But out here, 2 months of working side by side tells you more about a person than years of formal courtship back east." He closed the distance between them, taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight, just for you to consider it. You could keep this place as part of my holdings, or we could sell it if you prefer. Either way, you wouldn't have to face winter alone." Meredith looked down at their joined hands, his large and sun-darkened, her smaller but equally work-roughened. "And if I said I needed more time?" "To be sure that what I feel isn't just gratitude," Garrett's expression softened with understanding. "Then I'd say that's wise. I'm not going anywhere, Meredith. My feelings won't change." She studied his face in the fading light, the strong jawline, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes from years squinting in the sun, the mouth that smiled more easily now than when they'd first met. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding, for everything." He nodded, releasing her hands reluctantly. "I should head back. It'll be full dark soon." As Garrett rode away, Meredith remained on the porch long after his figure had disappeared into the night. His proposal had surprised her only in its timing, not its essence. Somewhere in the weeks of shared work and conversation, something had shifted between them. The question wasn't whether she had feelings for Garrett McAllister, but whether those feelings were strong enough to build a life upon. August brought scorching heat and the town's annual Founders' Day celebration. Meredith, still contemplating Garrett's proposal, decided to attend the festivities, her first social outing since her father's death. She wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had once been fashionable back east, and pinned her hair up with special care. Whispering pines had transformed for the occasion. Bunting decorated the main street buildings. Tables laden with food lined the square, and a platform had been erected for dancing. Children ran laughing through the crowd, while adults gathered in clusters to exchange news and gossip. Meredith's arrival drew attention. Many had heard of Garrett McAllister's interest in the Nelson widow, and curious eyes followed her as she made her way through the celebration. "Meredith Nelson, as I live and breathe," called Mrs. Hargrove, the storekeeper's wife. "Come join us, dear. You're looking so much better than the last time I saw you." Meredith smiled, accepting the invitation to join a group of women near the refreshment table. The conversation flowed around her news of births and illnesses, complaints about the heat, speculation about the harvest. "And when can we expect an announcement from you and Mr. McAllister?" asked Widow Parker bluntly, causing the other women to murmur in disapproval at her forwardness. Meredith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Mr. McAllister has been very kind in helping me with repairs to my property," she said carefully. Kind indeed, Widow Parker sniffed. A man like that doesn't spend weeks fixing fence posts for just anyone. Before Meredith could respond, a commotion near the edge of the square caught everyone's attention. A group of men had arrived on horseback, trail worn and dusty. At their center rode a man whose very posture commanded attention, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "Trouble," muttered Mrs. Hargrove. "That's Victor Hammond and his men." Meredith had heard of Hammond, a wealthy rancher from the north whose reputation for aggressive expansion preceded him. Rumors suggested he didn't always respect property lines or legal niceties in his quest to build his cattle empire. "What's he doing here?" Meredith asked, watching as the men dismounted. "Nothing good, I'd wager," replied Mrs. Hargrove. "He and Garrett McAllister have been at odds for years over water rights." As if summoned by his name, Garrett appeared at that moment, approaching from the direction of the livery. His casual stride belied the alertness in his posture as he moved to intercept Hammond. "McAllister," Hammond called, his voice carrying across the square. "Just the man I wanted to see." Garrett stopped a few paces from the newcomer, his expression neutral. "Hammond, didn't expect to see you at our little celebration." "Just passing through," Hammond replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard there might be some property available in these parts." A chill ran through Meredith as she realized Hammond's gaze had shifted briefly in her direction. Somehow, he knew about her struggling homestead. "Not that I'm aware of," Garrett replied evenly. "Folks around here are pretty attached to their land." Hammond's smile widened. "Everyone has a price, McAllister, even your little widow friend there." The assembled townspeople had fallen silent, watching the exchange with tense anticipation. Garrett's hands clenched briefly at his sides, but his voice remained controlled. "Miss Nelson's not looking to sell," he said. "And she's not a widow." "No," Hammond raised an eyebrow. "My mistake. Orphan, then. Either way, young woman alone, struggling property, seems like an opportunity." Meredith found herself moving forward before she'd made a conscious decision, drawn by some need to stand her own ground rather than have these men discuss her fate as if she weren't present. "Mr. Hammond," she said clearly, coming to stand beside Garrett. "If you're interested in purchasing property, you should speak to the owner directly." Hammond's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed with interest as he took in her appearance. "My apologies, Miss Nelson, Meredith Nelson, Miss Nelson," he acknowledged with a slight bow. "I admire directness. Perhaps we could discuss business privately." "There's nothing to discuss," Garrett interjected, his tone harder now. "Miss Nelson isn't selling." Hammond looked between them, his expression calculating. "I see. Well, should you change your mind, Miss Nelson, my offer will remain open. Your little farm sits on what could be excellent grazing land." "It's already excellent farming land," Meredith replied, lifting her chin, "and it's not for sale at any price." A flash of anger crossed Hammond's features, quickly masked. "Every piece of land has its price, Miss Nelson, and its proper use. Women alone often find that out the hard way." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Garrett took a step forward, his body now partially shielding Meredith. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Hammond," he said quietly. "I wouldn't advise it." For a tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might escalate further. Then Sheriff Taylor stepped forward from the crowd, his badge catching the sunlight. "Gentlemen," he said mildly, though his hand rested near his holster. "This is a celebration, let's keep it civil." Hammond's gaze lingered on Meredith for another moment before he nodded and stepped back. "Of course, Sheriff, we're just passing through, as I said." He tipped his hat to Meredith. "Think about my offer, Miss Nelson. A struggling homestead is a hard life for a woman alone." As Hammond and his men moved toward the saloon, the tension in the square gradually dissipated. Conversations resumed, though many curious glances were directed toward Meredith and Garrett. "Are you all right?" Garrett asked quietly, his eyes searching her face. "Yes," she said, though her heart was still racing. "How did he know about my farm?" "Hammond has eyes everywhere," Garrett replied grimly. "He's been buying up small holdings all across the territory, sometimes through less than honorable means." Meredith felt a chill despite the August heat. He seemed very interested. Your land has the best water access in the Eastern Valley, Garrett explained. Hammond's been trying to control the water rights throughout the region. It's why he and I have clashed before, understanding dawned on Meredith. So my father's little farm is actually valuable to the right buyer, yes, Garrett confirmed, or the wrong one. The music started up again, drawing people toward the dance platform. Garrett glanced in that direction, then back to Meredith with a questioning look. Would you care to dance, Miss Nelson? He asked formally, though his eyes held a warmth that belied the formality. I'd be delighted, Mr. McAllister, she replied, allowing him to lead her toward the platform. As they joined the other couples for a lively reel, Meredith pushed thoughts of Hammond from her mind. Garrett's hand was warm and steady on her back as he guided her through the steps, his usual reserve melting away in the joy of the dance. When he smiled down at her, eyes crinkling at the corners, she felt something settle in her heart, a certainty that had been building for weeks. Later, as the celebration continued into the evening, Garrett and Meredith found a moment of relative privacy near the edge of the square. Lanterns had been lit throughout the town, casting a golden glow over the festivities. Hammond's visit wasn't coincidence, Garrett said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. He must have heard about your situation and timed his arrival for maximum effect, Meredith nodded, having reached the same conclusion. He wanted to approach me publicly where I might feel pressured. He underestimated you, Garrett observed with admiration. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but he was right about one thing. A homestead is hard for anyone to maintain alone, let alone a woman. Garrett finished when she hesitated. Meredith gave him a wry smile. I was going to say someone without sufficient capital, but yes, being a woman doesn't help matters. Garrett's expression grew serious. Hammond won't give up easily. Once he sets his sights on a property, he's persistent. And not always ethical. What would you suggest? She asked, already suspecting his answer. My proposal still stands, he said quietly. Not just because of Hammond, though I can't deny his interest concerns me, but because these weeks with you have only strengthened my certainty. Meredith studied him in the lantern light, this man who had literally picked her up when she'd fallen and had been steadfastly supporting her ever since. Not out of pity, as she'd initially feared, but out of genuine respect and growing affection. I've been thinking about your proposal every day, she admitted, weighing what I know of you against the uncertainty of joining our lives so quickly. Hope flickered in his eyes. And I've realized that some certainties don't require years to recognize, she said softly. The way you work with purpose but without complaint, how you listen when I speak, truly listen, the respect you show not just to me but to everyone, regardless of their station. She took a deep breath. These aren't small things, Garrett. They're the foundation of something that could grow strong. He took her hands in his touch gentle despite the calluses earned through years of ranch work. Is that a yes, Meredith? She nodded, her heart suddenly too full for words. The joy that transformed his features was answer enough to any lingering doubts she might have harbored. Garrett McAllister was not a man who revealed his emotions easily, but in that moment, his feelings were written plainly for her to see. I'll speak to Reverend Collins tomorrow, he said, his voice roughened with emotion. Unless you'd prefer to wait. Meredith thought briefly of Hammond's threatening presence, of the coming harvest season, of the lonely winter that would follow if she remained at her homestead alone. But mostly she thought of the man before her, whose steady support had become the foundation of her days. No, she said firmly. No more waiting. News of their engagement spread through Whispering Pines with remarkable speed. By the following afternoon, when Garrett escorted Meredith to services at the small church, congratulations greeted them from every quarter. Only a few raised eyebrows at the rapid courtship, and these were mostly silenced by reminders of Meredith's precarious situation and Garrett's unimpeachable character. Reverend Collins agreed to perform the ceremony the following Saturday, allowing time for necessary preparations while acknowledging the practical reasons for haste as harvest season approached. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Meredith, with help from several town women, prepared her wedding dress, her mother's gown carefully altered to fit her slighter frame. Garrett, meanwhile, oversaw final improvements to the Nelson homestead, determined that it would be in perfect condition whether they chose to maintain it or sell. The question of where they would live after the wedding had been settled with surprising ease. Meredith would move to the McAllister ranch, but they would keep her homestead as part of their holdings, perhaps eventually installing a foreman to manage it as a separate operation. "Your father's dream doesn't have to end," Garrett had assured her. "We'll build on what he started." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the late August sun tempering its summer ferocity with hints of the coming autumn. Whispering Pines' small church was filled to capacity, the entire town turning out to witness the union of the struggling homesteader's daughter and one of the territory's most successful ranchers. Meredith stood at the back of the church, momentarily alone as she prepared to walk down the aisle. The altered wedding dress fit perfectly, its ivory satin softened by age but still elegant. In her hands, she held a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadow near her homestead. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the church doorway. The assembled guests rose, turning to watch her progress. But Meredith saw only Garrett, waiting for her at the altar. His expression as he caught sight of her, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and pride, brought tears to her eyes and certainty to her heart. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, exchanged in clear voices that carried through the hushed church. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett's kiss was gentle but held a promise that brought color to Meredith's cheeks and knowing smiles to the older women in the congregation. The celebration that followed at the town hall lasted well into the evening. There was music and dancing, a feast contributed by half the families in Whispering Pines, and toasts to the future happiness of the McAllisters. "You're radiant," Garrett murmured as they shared a quiet moment between dances. "Mrs. McAllister." The new name sent a thrill through Meredith. "It will take some getting used to," she admitted. "We have time," he replied, his hand warm at her waist. "A lifetime." As the evening drew to a close, they prepared to depart for the McAllister ranch, their home now. The traditional send-off involved much good-natured teasing and advice shouted after the departing couple, causing Meredith to blush furiously as Garrett helped her into the wagon he had decorated specially for the occasion. The journey to the ranch took over an hour, but it passed in comfortable conversation interspersed with companionable silences. When they crested the final hill and the McAllister ranch came into view, Meredith caught her breath at the sight. Lanterns had been hung along the drive and around the main house, their golden light creating a welcoming glow in the darkness. The ranch house itself was larger than she had imagined, a substantial two-story structure of weathered wood with a wide wraparound porch. Beyond it stretched out buildings, corrals, and in the distance, the shadowy forms of grazing cattle. "Welcome home," Garrett said softly as he brought the wagon to a stop before the house. Before Meredith could respond, he had jumped down and come around to her side. Instead of simply helping her descend, he lifted her into his arms, causing her to gasp in surprise. "Garrett, what are you doing?" he grinned, carrying her toward the house. "Carrying my bride over the threshold, it's tradition." "Is it also tradition to potentially throw your back out before the wedding night?" she teased, though she had wrapped her arms around his neck. His laugh rumbled against her side. "You're hardly a burden, Meredith." At the door he paused, his expression growing serious. "I want you to be happy here," he said. "This place has been just a house for too long. I'm hoping with you here it can become a home." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "We'll make it one together," she promised. Inside, Meredith discovered that Garrett had prepared for her arrival with touching thoughtfulness. The house was spotlessly clean, with fresh flowers on the dining table and new curtains at the windows. He showed her through the rooms with barely concealed pride, the large kitchen with its modern cookstove, the comfortable sitting room with bookshelves already containing some of her favorites that he had quietly transported from her homestead, and upstairs, the master bedroom with its carved oak furniture and a new quilt on the bed. "When did you manage all this?" she asked, turning to him in wonder. "I had some help," he admitted. "Mrs. Turner from town oversaw most of it. I just gave instructions." "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. Though larger and more prosperous than her small homestead, the house reflected Garrett's practical nature while offering comforts he had correctly anticipated she would appreciate. As the night deepened around them, the initial awkwardness of their new intimacy gave way to the natural progression of feelings that had been building between them for months. Garrett's tenderness and patience allowed Meredith to overcome her maidenly shyness, and in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they discovered the physical expression of the bond that had brought them together. Later, as Meredith lay in the circle of her husband's arms, listening to his steady breathing as he slept, she reflected on the extraordinary turn her life had taken. From the brink of destitution to becoming the wife of one of the territory's most respected ranchers, all because she had collapsed from hunger outside Hargrove's general store. Providence, her father would have called it. Meredith, watching the moonlight create patterns on the bedroom wall, was inclined to agree. The weeks that followed were a period of adjustment and discovery for both Meredith and Garrett. The rhythm of life on a large cattle ranch differed significantly from the smaller scale of her homestead, and Meredith found herself learning new skills while adapting her existing knowledge to their shared enterprise. Garrett's ranch hands, initially wary of having a woman suddenly in authority over domestic matters, soon came to respect Meredith's practical efficiency and genuine interest in the ranch's operations. Her improved cooking at the main house didn't hurt either, replacing the basic fare they had grown accustomed to under Garrett's bachelor management. For his part, Garrett discovered the profound difference between living alone and sharing his life with a partner. Having Meredith's voice greet him when he returned from long days on the range, finding the house transformed by her touch, waking beside her each morning, these simple changes filled a loneliness he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. They established a routine of visiting Meredith's homestead weekly, overseeing the harvest of her modest crops and planning improvements for the following spring. The property would never be large enough for significant cattle grazing, but Garrett suggested developing it for breeding horses, a complementary operation to his cattle business, and something Meredith had expressed interest in learning. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of the harsh Montana winter to come. The cattle were driven to lower pastures, final preparations made to buildings and equipment, and stores laid in for the months when travel to town would be difficult. It was during these preparations that Hammond made his presence felt again. Garrett returned from inspecting the northern fence line one evening, his expression grim. "Hammond's men have been moving his boundary markers again," he told Meredith as they sat at the dinner table. Pushing further into the disputed grazing land, Meredith frowned, familiar now with the ongoing conflict between the two ranchers. "Can the sheriff intervene?" "He could if there was clear proof," Garrett replied, frustration evident in his voice, "but Hammond's careful. He moves the markers gradually, makes it look like a misunderstanding rather than deliberate encroachment." "What will you do?" Garrett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "For now, document everything and have our men patrol the boundaries more frequently. There's too much at stake to let it go, but I won't be dragged into open conflict either." Meredith reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "You'll find a solution," she said with confidence. "You always do." His expression softened as he looked at her. "Having you here makes everything else seem more manageable somehow." "Even Hammond?" she asked with a small smile. "Even Hammond," he confirmed, turning his hand to clasp hers. The first snow came earlier than expected, a mid-October storm that blanketed the ranch in white and temporarily isolated them from town. Meredith, who had experienced Montana winters before, was well prepared for the enforced seclusion. The house was well stocked, and the close-knit community of the ranch, the hands who lived in the bunkhouse, the cook who managed their meals, and the elderly couple who helped with general maintenance, created its own society. On a particularly cold evening, as wind howled around the eaves of the house, Meredith and Garrett sat before the fire in their sitting room. She was engaged in mending while he reviewed accounts in preparation for spring cattle purchases. "I was thinking," Meredith said, setting aside her sewing, "about adding a schoolroom to the ranch next year." Garrett looked up surprised. "A schoolroom," she nodded, warming to her topic. "There are 4 children among the Hands families already, and the Turners have 3 more at their place just south of here. None of them are getting proper education beyond what their parents can manage after long work days." "And you want to teach them," Garrett surmised, his expression thoughtful. "I could start with basic lessons a few days a week," Meredith explained. "It wouldn't interfere with my duties here, especially if we converted that unused storage room off the kitchen." Garrett studied her animated face, recognizing the passion that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "You miss teaching, don't you?" Meredith hesitated. "I wouldn't say I miss it exactly, since I never had the opportunity to teach formally, but yes, I've always wanted to." He set aside his ledger and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. "Then you should have your schoolroom," he said simply. "We can start planning it now, have it ready by spring thaw." The joy that lit her features was all the confirmation he needed that he had made the right decision. Meredith threw her arms around his neck, nearly unbalancing them both. "Thank you," she whispered against his cheek, "for understanding what this means to me." Garrett held her close, marveling at how fulfilling it was to contribute to her happiness. "You've given up a lot to join your life with mine," he said seriously. "Your independence, your homestead. I haven't given up anything that matters," she interrupted, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "I've gained so much more than I ever lost." The sincerity in her voice moved him deeply. Their marriage had begun as a practical solution to mutual problems, her precarious situation, his solitary existence, but had grown into something far richer than either had anticipated. "I love you, Meredith McAllister," he said, the words coming easily now though they had been difficult to express at first. "And I love you," she replied, her smile soft in the firelight. "More than I ever thought possible when you carried me into Hargrove's store that day." Their kiss was interrupted by a sudden pounding on the front door, urgent and demanding even through the howl of the wind. Garrett was on his feet immediately, hand moving instinctively to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Who could that be in this weather? Meredith wondered, rising to follow as Garrett moved cautiously toward the door. The pounding came again, accompanied now by a voice shouting to be heard above the storm. "McAllister, open up, it's Jenkins." Garrett relaxed slightly, recognizing the voice of his foreman. He unbolted the door, admitting a snow-covered figure who stumbled into the warmth. "What is it, Jenkins?" Garrett asked, helping the man remove his ice-crusted coat. "What's happened?" Jenkins, a weathered man in his 40s who had been with the ranch since its early days, shook snow from his hat before answering. "Fire at the North Pasture Line cabin," he reported grimly. "Thomas rode in just now with the news, says it looks deliberate." "Hammond," Garrett said, the single word containing volumes of understanding. Jenkins nodded. "That would be my guess. Thomas says he saw riders heading north toward Hammond territory just before he spotted the flames. Anyone hurt?" "No, sir. Cabin was empty, thankfully." "But it's a total loss, and with this snow." "We can't rebuild until spring," Garrett finished, his expression hardening, "which means that entire section of grazing land will be effectively unmonitored." "Exactly," Jenkins confirmed. Meredith, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Could it have been an accident, a lightning strike, or not in this weather?" Garrett interrupted gently. "And not with riders seen leaving the scene." She nodded, understanding the implications. "What will you do?" Garrett exchanged a look with Jenkins. "For tonight, nothing. The storm makes any action impossible. Tomorrow, I'll ride out with a few men to assess the damage and secure what we can." After Jenkins had departed for the bunkhouse with instructions to prepare for the morning's expedition, Garrett returned to the sitting room where Meredith waited anxiously. "This is more than a boundary dispute now," she said quietly. "Destroying property crosses a line." Garrett nodded, his jaw tight. Hammond's escalating. He wants me to retaliate to give him an excuse for further action. Will you retaliate? No, Garrett said firmly. That's what he's hoping for, but I won't let this stand either. Tomorrow I'll document everything, then ride into town when the weather clears to file a formal complaint with the sheriff and the territorial marshal. Meredith studied her husband's face, seeing the controlled anger there but also the determination to handle the situation lawfully. It reinforced her faith in his character and judgment. Be careful tomorrow, she said softly. Hammond may have left men watching. He came to her then, drawing her into a protective embrace. I will, he promised. Hammond won't take anything else from us. The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Garrett departed with Jenkins and 3 other hands, heavily armed as a precaution, but with strict instructions to avoid confrontation if Hammond's men were encountered. Meredith moved through her daily tasks with less than her usual efficiency, her thoughts continually straying to Garrett and the potential danger he faced. By mid-afternoon, when the short winter day was already beginning to fade, her worry had intensified to the point that she found herself repeatedly checking the road leading to the ranch house. It was during one of these vigils at the front window that she spotted riders approaching, but not from the direction of the north pasture where Garrett had gone. These riders came from the east, following the main road from town. As they drew closer, Meredith's breath caught in her throat. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead rider's commanding posture. Victor Hammond had come calling. For a moment, Meredith considered refusing to answer if they knocked, pretending the house was empty. But such a ruse would be transparent with smoke rising from the chimney and lamps visible in the windows. Instead, she moved quickly to Garrett's study, unlocking the drawer where he kept a revolver. Though she had limited experience with firearms, her father had insisted she learn basic shooting skills when they moved west. The weight of the gun was unfamiliar but reassuring as she checked that it was loaded before slipping it into the pocket of her apron. By the time the riders reached the house, Meredith had composed herself and was waiting in the sitting room, a book open on her lap, though she had no attention to spare for reading. The expected knock came, firm but not threatening. Taking a deep breath, Meredith crossed to the door but did not immediately open it. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Victor Hammond, Mrs. McAllister," came the reply, smooth and confident. "I was hoping for a word with your husband." Meredith hesitated, one hand in her apron pocket resting on the revolver's grip. "My husband isn't here at present, Mr. Hammond. Perhaps you could return another time." There was a pause, then Hammond spoke again. "Actually, Mrs. McAllister, it's you I was hoping to speak with as well. Regarding your former property." This unexpected statement caught Meredith off guard. "My former property, the Nelson homestead," Hammond clarified. "May I come in? It's bitter cold out here and what I have to say would be better discussed comfortably." Meredith weighed her options quickly. Refusing entry to Hammond might provoke him, while allowing him in would at least keep the conversation civil. And despite his reputation, Hammond was unlikely to attempt anything untoward in his own person. His methods typically involved hired men doing his dirty work while maintaining his appearance as a respectable businessman. "Very well," she said, unbolting the door but keeping her hand in her pocket. "But only you, Mr. Hammond. Your men can wait outside." Hammond's eyebrows rose slightly at her stipulation, but he nodded in agreement. "Of course, Davis, Miller wait with the horses." Meredith stepped back, allowing Hammond to enter the house. He was even more imposing up close, tall and broad-shouldered, expensively dressed despite the practicalities of winter travel, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. McAllister," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Especially given the tensions between your husband's operation and mine." Meredith led him to the sitting room, deliberately taking a seat that placed the fireplace poker within easy reach. "What is it you wish to discuss about my homestead, Mr. Hammond?" Hammond settled into the chair opposite her, his calculating gaze taking in the room and her with obvious assessment. I understand that since your marriage, the property has been somewhat neglected. Understandably so, given the demands of managing Mr. McAllister's much larger enterprise. The homestead is being maintained, Meredith corrected him. We have plans for developing it further in the spring. Hammond smiled indulgently. Plans often change, Mrs. McAllister, especially with the challenges of winter ahead and the unfortunate incidents that seem to be occurring. The veiled reference to the cabin fire confirmed Meredith's suspicions about Hammond's involvement. Are you referring to the destruction of our line cabin, Mr. Hammond, the one witnesses saw riders fleeing from last night? If she had hoped to disconcert him with this direct accusation, she was disappointed. Hammond's smile didn't falter. A tragic occurrence, certainly. The frontier can be a dangerous place, especially in winter, which brings me to my proposition. He leaned forward, his manner shifting to one of earnest business discussion. I'm prepared to offer a very generous sum for the Nelson homestead, 3 times its market value. This would provide capital for your husband to reinforce his existing holdings rather than stretching resources to develop marginal land. Meredith kept her expression neutral, though inside she was seething at Hammond's presumption. The homestead isn't for sale, Mr. Hammond, at any price. Every property has its price, Mrs. McAllister, Hammond said, echoing his words from their first meeting. And every person their breaking point. Your husband is facing challenges on multiple fronts now: the destroyed cabin, potential rustling activity that's been reported in the area, the severe winter that's predicted. The implicit threat was unmistakable. Are you suggesting that these challenges will continue if we don't sell my homestead to you? Hammond's expression hardened slightly at her directness. I'm suggesting that business decisions should be practical, not emotional. That land would serve better as part of my operation with its access to the eastern water rights. So that's what this is about, Meredith said, understanding dawning, the water rights. My father's property controls access to the stream that feeds your eastern grazing lands. Your father was a stubborn man, Hammond acknowledged. He refused reasonable offers as well. A cold certainty settled in Meredith's chest. Did you approach him before his death? Several times, Hammond admitted easily. He was unreasonably attached to that small parcel, but I had hopes that you, being more pragmatic, might see the wisdom in selling. And when I didn't, Meredith continued, the pieces falling into place, you escalated to intimidation. First at the Founders' Day celebration, now with the destruction of our property. Hammond stood abruptly, his patience evidently wearing thin. Be careful with accusations, Mrs. McAllister. They can be dangerous without proof. Meredith rose as well, her hand returning to the pocket containing Garrett's revolver. I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Hammond. My husband will return soon, and I doubt he'd appreciate finding you here. Hammond studied her for a long moment, reassessing. Whatever he saw in her determined stance caused him to step back slightly. Consider my offer, Mrs. McAllister. It won't remain open indefinitely. There's nothing to consider, Meredith said firmly. The Nelson homestead remains in McAllister hands. Now please leave. As Hammond retrieved his hat and moved toward the door, he paused for a parting shot. Your loyalty to your husband is admirable. I hope he returns it in equal measure when difficult choices must be made. With that cryptic statement, he departed, leaving Meredith shaken but resolute. She watched from the window as Hammond rejoined his men and rode away, only then allowing herself to sink into a chair, her legs suddenly weak with delayed reaction. When Garrett returned an hour later, the evidence of the deliberate arson clear in his grim expression, Meredith immediately told him of Hammond's visit. He came here, Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet, to our home while I was away. He wanted to make an offer on my homestead, Meredith explained, recounting the conversation in detail. 3 times its value, he said. Garrett paced the sitting room, his anger palpable. The water rights, that's what he's been after all along. Your father's property controls the primary access to the eastern watershed. If Hammond controlled that, he could restrict water to the surrounding smallholdings, Meredith finished. Force more sales. Exactly. Garrett stopped pacing to look at her intently. You didn't consider his offer, did you? The question stung, but Meredith understood it came from Hammond's manipulative reputation rather than doubt in her. Not for a second, she assured him. That land is part of our future, Garrett, and I won't be intimidated into selling. Relief and pride mingled in his expression. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. I'm sorry you had to face him alone. That was likely his intention all along, to catch you here without me, thinking you'd be more vulnerable to pressure. He underestimated me, Meredith said with a small smile. It seems to be a habit of his. One that will cost him eventually, Garrett said grimly. This has gone beyond boundary disputes now. Destruction of property, implied threats, these are matters for the law. Will the sheriff act? Meredith asked, doubtful based on what she'd seen of the local lawman's reluctance to challenge powerful interests. Perhaps not on his own, Garrett acknowledged, but the territorial marshal might, especially with the pattern Hammond's establishing. First thing tomorrow, weather permitting, I'm riding to town to file formal complaints. That night, as they prepared for bed, Meredith noticed Garrett wincing slightly as he removed his shirt. You're hurt, she said, moving closer to examine a large bruise forming on his side. It's nothing, he dismissed. Slipped on some ice while examining the cabin ruins. Meredith looked at him skeptically but didn't press the issue. Later, as they lay in the darkness of their bedroom, she voiced the concern that had been growing since Hammond's visit. He won't stop with the cabin, will he? Garrett's arm tightened around her. No, he admitted. Hammond doesn't back down once he's set his sights on something. I'm worried, Garrett, she confessed. Not about the homestead or even this ranch, but about you. The way Hammond spoke it was as if he'd already decided what would happen. I can handle Hammond, Garrett assured her, though there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was less confident than his words indicated. But I want you to promise me something, Meredith. What? If anything happens to me, don't say that, she interrupted, fear tightening her throat. If anything happens, he continued firmly, don't try to hold on to both properties. Sell the homestead if necessary, use the capital to secure this ranch. Your safety and security matter more than any piece of land. Meredith raised herself on one elbow to look down at him in the dim light. Nothing is going to happen to you, she said with more conviction than she felt. We'll face Hammond together and we'll win. Garrett reached up to touch her cheek tenderly. With you beside me, I almost believe that's possible. The journey to town the next day was delayed by another snowstorm that swept across the territory, leaving drifts too deep for safe travel. It was 2 days before Garrett could make the trip, accompanied by Jenkins and 2 other hands for security. In his absence, Meredith found herself jumpier than usual, startling at unexpected sounds and keeping the revolver within reach as she moved through her daily tasks. The ranch hands, sensing her unease, made a point of checking in regularly and maintaining visible patrols around the property. When Garrett finally returned late in the afternoon, his expression told Meredith everything she needed to know before he even spoke. The sheriff won't act without more evidence, he reported, hanging his snow-covered coat by the door. Says a burned cabin in a snowstorm could have any number of causes, and Hammond's visit here was just a business proposition, not a threat. And the territorial marshal? Meredith asked, already suspecting the answer. Away until spring, apparently, Garrett said bitterly. Convenient timing. Meredith guided him to the kitchen where she had kept dinner warming. So we're on our own. Not entirely, Garrett said, accepting the plate of stew she set before him. Word is spreading about Hammond's tactics. Other ranchers are getting concerned about his expansion. There's talk of forming an association to present a united front. Will that help? Garrett shrugged. It might in time, but Hammond's not going to wait while we organize. He's made his play and he'll be expecting a response. What will we do? Meredith asked, sitting across from him. For now, increase security. Double patrols, especially around your homestead. I've hired 2 more hands men Jenkins vouches for who have experience with this kind of situation. He reached across the table to take her hand. We'll get through this, Meredith. Hammond isn't the first land grabber to try these tactics, and those who came before him eventually overreached. Despite his reassurances, Meredith sensed Garrett was holding something back, some piece of information or plan he wasn't ready to share. She didn't press him, trusting that he would confide in her when he felt the time was right. The following weeks brought an uneasy peace. Hammond made no further overt moves against McAllister property, but reports filtered in of increased activity around the boundaries of their land. Riders observed watching from a distance, unfamiliar men in town asking questions about the ranch's operations. As December arrived with its shortened days and holiday preparations, the tension remained a constant undercurrent to ranch life. Meredith threw herself into creating a festive atmosphere for their first Christmas together, determined not to let Hammond's threats overshadow this special time. She decorated the house with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, prepared traditional treats, and even organized a small celebration for the ranch hands and their families. Garrett, seeing her efforts, seemed to relax somewhat, allowing himself to be drawn into the holiday spirit despite the ongoing concerns. On Christmas Eve, with a light snow falling outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, they exchanged gifts in the privacy of their sitting room. Garrett presented Meredith with a beautiful leather-bound set of Shakespeare's works that he had specially ordered from back east months earlier. "They're exquisite," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed covers. "How did you know?" "You mentioned once that your mother had a similar set that was lost in your move west," he explained. "I hoped these might serve as a replacement of sorts." Deeply touched by his thoughtfulness, Meredith presented her gift to Garrett, a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue that had taken her weeks of secret evening work, and a small wooden box. "Open it," she urged when he looked at her questioningly. Inside the box was a small pair of hand-knitted baby booties in white yarn. Garrett stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment before understanding dawned on his face. "Meredith," he whispered, looking up at her with wonder, "are you?" She nodded, her eyes bright with happy tears. "In June, Dr. Williams thinks. I wanted to be certain before telling you." Garrett set the box carefully aside before pulling her into his arms, his embrace gentle as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our baby." "Our family," Meredith corrected, leaning back to look into his face. "The three of us." The joy that transformed Garrett's features in that moment seemed to erase the worry lines that had deepened over recent weeks. He kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about his feelings, then placed a gentle hand over her still flat stomach. "This changes everything," he said softly. Meredith knew he wasn't referring just to their personal lives, but to the situation with Hammond as well. Their child's future was now part of every calculation, every decision about the ranch and their response to threats. "We'll protect our family," she said with quiet determination. "All of it, this land, this home, our child." Garrett nodded, his expression sobering though the joy remained in his eyes. "Yes, we will, which is why I've made a decision I need to discuss with you." He led her back to their seats by the fire, keeping her hand in his. "I've been corresponding with the governor's office about Hammond's activities. It seems he's been using similar tactics throughout the territory, and complaints have been accumulating. The governor can't intervene directly in property disputes, but, Meredith prompted when he hesitated. "There's a federal marshal being dispatched after the new year to investigate claims of mail fraud and intimidation across territorial lines. Hammond's been buying properties under different company names, using the Postal Service to conduct business that skirts legal boundaries." Hope flared in Meredith's heart. "That could stop him." "It could," Garrett confirmed. "But we need to hold out until then, and Hammond seems to be escalating. There's been rustling reported at the Carson place north of here, small numbers of cattle, but significant for an operation their size." "You think Hammond is behind it?" "I'm almost certain," Garrett said grimly. "It fits his pattern pressure from multiple directions until selling seems the only option." Meredith considered this, one hand unconsciously moving to her abdomen where their child grew. "What do we need to do?" "I want to send you to town after Christmas," Garrett said carefully, "to stay with the Turners until this is resolved. Sarah Turner would welcome the company and you'd be safer there." "No," Meredith said immediately, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "My place is here with you." "Especially now." "Meredith, think of the baby," Garrett urged. "If Hammond's men decide to target the main house, then we'll face that together," she interrupted. "I won't be sent away like a child while you handle this alone. This is my home, our ranch. I won't be driven from it by fear." Garrett studied her determined expression, a mixture of frustration and pride in his eyes. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Meredith McAllister." "Thank you," she replied with a small smile. "I consider that a compliment," he sighed, recognizing a losing argument. "At least promise me you'll stay close to the house, keep that revolver nearby, and listen to Jenkins if he advises evacuation." "I promise," she agreed readily. "I'm not being reckless, Garrett. I understand the danger, but this child deserves parents who stand their ground when it matters." As they prepared for bed that night, the news of the baby and the potential federal intervention had lightened the atmosphere despite the ongoing threats. For the first time in weeks, Meredith fell asleep without the weight of fear pressing on her chest, Garrett's protective arm around her providing all the security she needed. Christmas Day passed peacefully, with a modest celebration including the ranch hands and their families. Meredith and Garrett kept their baby news private for now, wanting to wait until the situation with Hammond was resolved before sharing their joy more widely. The days between Christmas and New Year brought heavy snowfall, effectively isolating the ranch and limiting Hammond's ability to cause trouble. Garrett used the enforced respite to strengthen defenses and plan for various contingencies, while Meredith began sketching ideas for converting one of the unused bedrooms into a nursery. On New Year's Eve, they retired early, the storm outside making the warmth of their bedroom all the more appealing. As they lay together in the quiet darkness, Meredith voiced the hope that had been growing since Christmas. "Perhaps the worst is behind us," she suggested. "The federal marshal will arrive soon. The heavy snow limits what Hammond can do, and by spring, this could all be resolved." Garrett pulled her closer, his hand resting protectively over the slight curve of her abdomen that was just becoming noticeable. "I hope you're right," he said. "I want our child born into peace, not conflict. He or she will be," Meredith assured him with more confidence than she truly felt. "This is just a difficult chapter in our story, not the whole book." Garrett's chuckle rumbled against her back. "When did you become the optimist between us?" "When I realized I had so much to be optimistic about," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "You, our child, this life we're building together." His kiss was tender, filled with promise. "I love you, Meredith, more than I ever thought possible." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "Always." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the storm howling outside but unable to touch the warmth they had created together. Neither suspected that their hopeful peace was about to be shattered. The sound of gunfire woke them shortly after midnight, distant at first, then closer. Garrett was on his feet instantly, reaching for clothes and his rifle in practiced movements. "Stay here," he ordered Meredith, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Lock the door behind me." Before she could protest, he was gone, moving quickly down the hallway toward the commotion. Meredith pulled on her robe and reached for Garrett's revolver from the bedside drawer, her heart pounding. Despite his instruction to stay put, she moved to the window, pulling back the curtain cautiously. What she saw froze her blood. Flames were rising from the direction of the barn, bright orange against the night sky. Dark figures moved in the yard, exchanging gunfire with defenders positioned around the main house. Hammond's men had come at last, taking advantage of the New Year's celebration when vigilance might be relaxed. Meredith's first instinct was to find Garrett, to ensure he was safe. But she forced herself to think rationally. Moving through the house in darkness would make her a target for stray bullets, and the baby, she had to think of their child now. A sudden crash downstairs galvanized her into action. Someone had broken into the house. Meredith positioned herself at the top of the stairs, revolver steady in her hands despite her racing heart. She wouldn't fire blindly, but she wouldn't allow intruders to reach her either. "Mrs. McAllister," a voice called urgently from below. "It's Jenkins, are you up there?" Relief flooded through her. Yes, I'm here. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs, revealing Jenkins with a shotgun in his hands and blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. We need to get you out of here, he said without preamble. Hammond's men have set fire to the barn and bunkhouse. They're trying to drive us into the open. Where's Garrett? Meredith demanded, already moving to pull on clothes. Fighting with the men near the corral, Jenkins replied grimly. He sent me to get you to safety. There's a wagon ready at the back of the house. I'm not leaving without him, Meredith insisted, fastening her dress with trembling fingers. Jenkins's expression hardened. Boss's orders, madam, and with the baby coming, he told you? Meredith interrupted, surprised. Needed me to understand why getting you to safety was priority, Jenkins explained. Now please, we don't have much time. Recognizing the wisdom in Garrett's plan even as she chafed against it, Meredith nodded. Give me 1 minute. She quickly gathered a few essential items: the revolver, a small pouch of money Garrett kept in his desk, a warm coat, and the photograph of their wedding day. As an afterthought, she grabbed the baby booties she had shown Garrett on Christmas Eve, tucking them into her pocket. Jenkins led her downstairs and through the kitchen to the back door, where a small wagon waited with one of the younger ranch hands at the reins. The night was chaos: shouts and gunfire, the crackling of flames, the frightened whinnying of horses. Get her to the Turner place, Jenkins instructed the young man. Don't stop for anything. Wait, Meredith said, clutching Jenkins's arm. Tell Garrett she stopped, overwhelmed by the fear that she might not see her husband again. Jenkins's weathered face softened slightly. I'll tell him you're safe and that you'll be waiting for him. He'll come for you when this is over, Mrs. McAllister. The boss isn't a man who breaks his promises. With that small reassurance, Meredith allowed herself to be helped into the wagon. As they pulled away, she looked back at the ranch house, their home silhouetted against the flames that consumed the outbuildings. Somewhere in that chaos was Garrett, fighting not just for their property but for their future. The journey to the Turner Ranch was harrowing, the wagon bouncing over snow-covered terrain as they avoided the main road where Hammond's men might be watching. The young hand Billy, Meredith recalled, kept the horses moving at a dangerous pace despite the conditions. Hammond's been planning this for weeks, Billy told her as they jolted along. One of his men got drunk in town yesterday, started bragging about how they were going to run McAllister off his land once and for all. Why didn't anyone warn us? Meredith asked, clutching the seat as the wagon hit a particularly deep rut. The fella sobered up and disappeared before Sheriff Taylor could question him proper, Billy explained. Jenkins sent a rider, but the storm delayed him. By the time we knew for sure, they were already moving in. The Turner Ranch came into view as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, a substantial homestead similar to the McAllister place, though smaller in scale. Sarah Turner, awakened by their arrival, took one look at Meredith's disheveled appearance and immediately ushered her inside, calling for her husband to tend to Billy and the horses. Hammond's men attacked the ranch, Meredith explained shakily as Sarah pressed a cup of hot tea into her hands. Garrett sent me here for safety, but he's still there, fighting. Sarah's kind face registered alarm but not surprise. James said something like this might happen. Hammond's been getting bolder with each success. She patted Meredith's hand reassuringly. James will gather men and ride to help as soon as it's light enough. Garrett won't face this alone. The waiting that followed was the most excruciating experience of Meredith's life. Sarah tried to distract her with breakfast and conversation, but Meredith could barely eat, her thoughts constantly with Garrett and the men defending their home. Mid-morning brought the sound of approaching riders. Meredith rushed to the window, heart in her throat, praying to see Garrett among them. Instead, she recognized James Turner returning with his men and a figure slumped over a horse, clearly injured. Garrett, she whispered, already moving toward the door despite Sarah's attempt to hold her back. But as the riders drew closer, Meredith saw that the injured man was Jenkins, not Garrett. Relief and renewed fear warred within her as she hurried out to meet them. "Where's Garrett?" she demanded as James Turner helped ease Jenkins down from his horse. The foreman's left arm hung uselessly at his side, a blood-stained bandage wrapped around his shoulder. "Still at the ranch, madam," Jenkins replied, his face gray with pain. Hammond's men withdrew at dawn when they realized reinforcements were coming from neighboring ranches. But not before they'd done considerable damage. "Is he hurt?" Meredith pressed, needing to know. "Caught a bullet in the leg," Jenkins admitted reluctantly. "Nothing serious, but it's slowing him down. He sent me ahead to let you know he's all right and will be along once things are secure." Relief made Meredith's knees weak. Sarah led her back inside while the men tended to Jenkins's wound. As the day wore on with no sign of Garrett, Meredith's anxiety returned despite Jenkins's assurances. By late afternoon, she was pacing the Turners' sitting room, unable to focus on anything but the road visible from the window. When riders finally appeared on the horizon, Meredith didn't wait for them to reach the house. She grabbed her coat and hurried outside, ignoring Sarah's calls to wait. As the group drew closer, she scanned frantically for Garrett's familiar figure, there at the center of the group, riding tall despite the bandage visible on his thigh. The moment Garrett saw her running toward them, he urged his horse forward, separating from the others. He didn't even properly stop the animal before swinging down from the saddle, stumbling slightly as his injured leg took his weight. Meredith flew into his arms, heedless of the watching men or the propriety of such a display. Garrett held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, his breathing ragged with emotion rather than exertion. "You're safe," he murmured against her ear. "Thank God you're safe, and you," she replied, pulling back to examine him anxiously. "Jenkins said you were shot." "It's nothing," Garrett dismissed, though his pallor suggested otherwise. "Barely grazed me. The ranch took worse damage than I did." "How bad?" Meredith asked, allowing him to lean on her as they walked slowly toward the house. "Barn's gone. Bunkhouse too, lost some livestock," his jaw tightened. "But they'll pay for it, Meredith. Hammond crossed a line attacking our home." Inside, once Garrett's wound had been properly tended and he had eaten, he provided a fuller account of the night's events. Hammond's men had attacked in force, clearly intending to destroy enough of the ranch's infrastructure to make continuing operations impossible. "What they didn't count on was neighbors coming to our aid," Garrett explained, gesturing to the men who had accompanied him. "Carson brought his hands despite the rustling they've suffered. Williams and Peterson too. By dawn, Hammond's men were outnumbered and withdrew. And Hammond himself?" Meredith asked. "Not present," Garrett said grimly, keeping his hands clean as usual. "But we have witnesses this time, men who will testify they were hired by Hammond specifically to drive us off our land." "The federal marshal arrived in Helena yesterday," Garrett confirmed. "Word came just before you got here. He's already been notified about last night's attack." Hope surged in Meredith's heart. "Then it's nearly over." Garrett took her hand, his expression serious. "It's not that simple. Hammond's a powerful man with connections. The marshal will build his case carefully. In the meantime," he hesitated, clearly reluctant to continue. "In the meantime." Meredith prompted. "In the meantime, I want you to stay here with the Turners," Garrett said. "At least until basic repairs to the ranch house are complete. It's not safe there now, especially in your condition." Meredith wanted to protest, but saw the wisdom in his request. The ranch would be a construction zone for weeks, with limited security while rebuilding took priority. "How long?" "A month, perhaps two," Garrett estimated. "I'll visit as often as possible, of course." Though the separation would be difficult, Meredith nodded her agreement. 2 months, no longer. I want our baby born at home, Garrett." The smile that touched his lips then was tender despite his exhaustion. "Our home will be ready, I promise." The weeks that followed were challenging for both of them. Garrett threw himself into rebuilding the ranch, working alongside his men from dawn until dusk, despite his healing leg. Meredith, meanwhile, found herself restless at the Turner place despite Sarah's kind companionship and the comfort of knowing she was safe. News came regularly from town and the wider territory. The federal marshal was methodically building a case against Hammond, interviewing witnesses and gathering documentation of his various schemes. Hammond himself had grown uncharacteristically quiet, reportedly spending more time in Helena with lawyers than overseeing his ranching operations. By early March, significant progress had been made at the McAllister Ranch. The bunkhouse had been rebuilt. A temporary shelter served in place of the barn until a more permanent structure could be constructed, and the main house had been repaired from the minor damage it had sustained during the attack. When Garrett arrived at the Turner place in mid-March, his expression held a satisfaction Meredith hadn't seen since before Hammond's escalation. "It's over," he announced as soon as they were alone. "Hammond has been indicted on multiple federal charges: mail fraud, intimidation, conspiracy. The marshal arrested him yesterday in Helena." Meredith felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. "He'll go to prison, most likely," Garrett confirmed. "More importantly, his assets are frozen pending the outcome of the trial. He can't continue his operations or finance further attacks." Relief brought tears to Meredith's eyes. Pregnancy had made her more emotional, a fact that still sometimes caught her by surprise. "Then we can go home. That's why I'm here," Garrett said, taking her hands in his. "To bring you home where you belong, if you're ready." "I've been ready since the day I left," Meredith admitted. The return to the McAllister Ranch the following day was emotional for Meredith. The damage was still evident: blackened earth where the barn had stood, new lumber where repairs had been made to outbuildings, fewer cattle in the nearby pastures. But the house stood strong, and as Garrett helped her down from the wagon, she felt a profound sense of homecoming. Inside, she discovered that Garrett had surprised her. One of the upstairs bedrooms had been transformed into a nursery with a beautiful hand-crafted cradle as its centerpiece. "Jenkins made it," Garrett explained as Meredith ran her hands over the smooth wood. "Said every McAllister baby should have a proper cradle." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Meredith's eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered, envisioning their child sleeping peacefully in the cradle just months from now. Spring arrived with renewed promise. The ranch slowly recovered from Hammond's attack, with new buildings rising to replace those lost and the natural rhythms of ranching life resuming. News came that Hammond's trial had begun in Helena, with multiple witnesses testifying against him, including some of his former employees who had turned evidence in exchange for leniency. By May, Meredith's pregnancy was well advanced, her belly rounded prominently beneath her dresses. Garrett had become increasingly protective, limiting her activities despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of continuing most of her duties. "The baby will be here soon enough," he would remind her gently. "There will be plenty of work waiting afterward." In early June, as Meredith's time grew near, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch: Dr. Williams's wife, a trained midwife who had delivered most of the children in Whispering Pines. "Your husband arranged for me to stay until the baby comes, Mrs. Williams explained, setting down her bag in the guest room. Said he wasn't taking any chances with his wife and child. Meredith was torn between exasperation at Garrett's overprotectiveness and gratitude for his foresight. As it happened, his caution proved justified. That very night, Meredith awoke to the first pains of labor. What followed was a long, difficult birth that tested Meredith's strength and endurance to their limits. Through it all, Garrett remained nearby, though tradition kept him from the birthing room itself. Jenkins later reported that the boss had worn a path in the hallway carpet with his pacing, stopping only to pray or to press his ear to the door when Meredith's cries were particularly concerning. Shortly after dawn the following day, Elizabeth Grace McAllister entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately announced her strong constitution. When Mrs. Williams finally allowed Garrett into the room, the sight of his exhausted wife holding their tiny daughter reduced this strong, capable rancher to tears. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the downy dark hair that covered Elizabeth's small head. "And so are you," he added, pressing a reverent kiss to Meredith's forehead. "She has your eyes," Meredith murmured tiredly, though in truth it was too early to tell whose features the baby would favor. "And your determination," Garrett replied with a smile. Mrs. Williams says she's never seen a baby so intent on arriving on her own schedule despite all attempts to ease her path. Meredith laughed softly, wincing at the movement. A true McAllister, then. News of Elizabeth's birth spread quickly through the region, bringing a stream of visitors and gifts once Meredith was strong enough to receive them. Even in the frontier's harsh conditions, the birth of a child was cause for communal celebration, a sign of hope and continuity in a land that often took more than it gave. Among the letters of congratulation that arrived was a newspaper clipping from Helena, reporting that Victor Hammond had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his various crimes. The accompanying note from Sheriff Taylor expressed his regrets for not acting sooner and his congratulations on the McAllisters' new addition. Summer passed in a haze of newborn care and ranch operations. Elizabeth thrived, growing stronger each day under the devoted attention of her parents and the entire ranch community. Jenkins, in particular, appointed himself unofficial guardian, carving small wooden animals for the baby and allowing his gruff exterior to soften whenever she was present. By August, as Elizabeth approached 2 months old, life at the McAllister Ranch had settled into new rhythms that accommodated both the needs of the baby and the demands of the ranch. Meredith found herself adapting to motherhood with the same determined competence she brought to everything, though she often admitted to Garrett that she felt she was learning something new every day. On a warm evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Elizabeth slept in Meredith's arms, Garrett raised a subject they had discussed only briefly since the attack. "I've been thinking about the Nelson homestead," he said, his gaze on the distant hills. "It's been standing empty since winter, though Jenkins has kept an eye on it." Meredith looked at him curiously. "What about it?" "I was wondering if you might consider converting it to the school you've talked about," Garrett suggested. "The location is good central to several neighboring ranches with children. The house could be expanded for classrooms, and we could build simple accommodations for a teacher." Surprise and pleasure filled Meredith. "You've given this a lot of thought." Garrett smiled, reaching over to brush a finger gently against Elizabeth's cheek. "Our daughter will need education eventually, so will the children of our hands and neighbors. You had the right idea all along. This territory needs schools if it's to grow properly." "And you think I should teach?" Meredith asked, already envisioning how the homestead might be transformed. "Eventually, perhaps, if you want to," Garrett said, "when Elizabeth is older. For now, we could look for a qualified teacher from back east. There are programs that send educated women west for just this purpose." The idea took hold in Meredith's imagination. "It would be a fitting legacy for my father's dream," she said thoughtfully. "Not exactly what he envisioned, but something that would serve the community he loved." "Then we'll do it," Garrett decided. "Start planning this fall, begin construction in the spring." As darkness settled around them and the first stars appeared in the evening sky, Meredith reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From collapsing in desperation outside Hargrove's general store to sitting on the porch of a prosperous ranch, her husband beside her and their child in her arms, a path she could never have envisioned, yet one that felt somehow destined. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, noting her contemplative expression. "How everything changed because I fainted that day in town," she admitted. "If I hadn't been at my lowest point, if you hadn't been there at that exact moment." "Providence," Garrett suggested, echoing her own thoughts from months earlier. "Perhaps," Meredith agreed, "or perhaps simply the way life unfolds when good people act with kindness." She looked down at their sleeping daughter, then up at the man whose quiet strength had become the cornerstone of her world. "Either way, I'm grateful." Garrett leaned over to kiss her gently, careful not to disturb the baby. "As am I, Meredith McAllister, more than I could ever express." As night fell completely over the Montana landscape, the McAllister Ranch stood as a beacon of hard-won peace in a territory still finding its way toward civilization. Inside its walls, a family that had been forged through crisis now looked toward a future bright with possibility for themselves, for their daughter, and for the community they were helping to build in this wild, beautiful land. The school at the former Nelson homestead opened its doors the following spring, with a young teacher from Boston presiding over a dozen children from neighboring ranches. Meredith, now mother to a lively 1-year-old Elizabeth, served on the small board that oversaw the school's operations, ensuring that her father's property fulfilled its new purpose with the same dedication he had shown in establishing it. Hammond's downfall led to the dissolution of his holdings, with many of the small ranchers and farmers he had displaced able to reclaim their properties through a court-mandated settlement. The McAllister Ranch, under Garrett and Meredith's joint management, continued to prosper, becoming known throughout the territory not just for its excellent cattle, but for the fair treatment of its workers and neighbors. And in the years that followed, as Elizabeth was joined by 2 brothers and eventually a younger sister, the story was often told of how their parents' life together began with a young woman's collapse outside a general store, a cowboy's instinctive kindness, and a journey home that led to a future neither could have imagined when they first met on that dusty Montana street in the summer of 1878.